Tanshi, my name is Josh McKenna, and I live on the ancestral territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations in so-called Vancouver, BC. I'm Métis. My family's roots run deep in Treaty 1 territory of the Red River Valley in Manitoba. My family names include Carrier, Hamlin, Vandal, Parenteau, Landry, Laurence, McGilvery, and the unnamed Cree women that populate my family tree. Today on the podcast, we have Elder Tony Belcourt as our guest. So Tony Belcourt is a Métis rights leader and activist. He was the first president of the Native Council of Canada from 1971 to 1974, and he is best known for his work as the founding president of the Métis Nation of Ontario in 1993 and his leadership throughout the Powley case in 2003. Belcourt was born in the Métis community of Lac St. Anne, Alberta, and is carried by the pipe. Tony, thanks so much for coming on today.
Well, it's a real pleasure. I'm really happy to do this, Josh. Happy to have met you at Patosh.
Yeah, I'm happy to have met you as well. Tony and I met for the first time. We'd emailed back and forth a bit, and then we both realized we were going to be at the Back to Patosh festival about a week later. So we got to meet up and chat for the first time at the MNO Pavilion. So yeah, great to meet in person before we hop on a Zoom call together. So Tony, one of the things that I was mainly hoping to focus our episode around today for us to talk about is, and I'll provide the audience with a bit of background for if they don't know your history as a Métis rights leader. But I wanted to talk about kind of like negotiating with colonial governments as well as direct action. Because you've proven to have some amazing success with negotiating with the Canadian government in particular. So I just kind of wanted to get into how you've approached that over the years. And I thought we could kind of hop in sort of where your career started in Métis politics. I was thinking we could talk about how it started all in the 60s and that throughout the past 50 plus years, you've served in various roles with the Métis Association of Alberta, to the Native Council of Canada, to the Métis Nation of Ontario, to name a few. So I just wanted to know, how has the political landscape changed for the Métis over time? How have we progressed as a people, and where have we yet to go?
Well, I was also a member of the Board of Governors of the Métis National Council for some 15 years. Mm-hmm. The landscape today is so different than it was when we first started back in the 60s and 70s. In those days, our people were living in shacks and road allowances. I mean, many still are, but not to the degree it is now. And there was no way that our people could get housing when you come into town. As soon as smoky sounds of Cree were heard in anyone's voice, they were turned away. Our people didn't have education back then. Our people didn't have degrees. I mean, the exception was probably Howard Adams. The racism was, you could just cut it with a knife. I mean, there's racism on now, but not to the same degree as it was back then, and not as open either as it was back then. We were dealing with those kinds of issues that they're similar in many ways today, but just not the same. Mm-hmm. And one of the big reasons is because in 1981, we got into the Constitution of Canada. Constitution Act 1982 says the existing Aboriginal and treaty rights of the Aboriginal peoples are hereby recognized and affirmed. And it specifies that the Aboriginal peoples are the Indians, the Inuit, and the Métis. Thanks to Harry Daniels for that. Mm-hmm. In 1968-9, when I was involved at the Métis Association of Alberta, that was our focus, looking after the issues our people were facing, poverty and ill health and lack of housing. Those were the pressing issues. But also in the back of my mind was the whole notion of getting our land back. That was my dad's, one of the thing my dad was always talking about, our land, loss of land. And our people, when they came to pilgrimage every year at Lac Saint Anne, in those days, 10,000 people coming in, old trucks and old wagons and horse and buggy, and pitching their tents and teepees. Everybody was talking about our land, our loss of our land. We lost it, Batoche. How are we going to get our land back? I had done a bit of reading on all of that, and it occurred to me that we got cut out of the treaties, and there's the government of Alberta set up these settlements in Alberta, but that was a government of Alberta's initiative that they did out of the goodness of their heart, I guess, if you want to put it that way. Not that they had any obligation, but because of the Royal Proclamation of 1763, I knew that the Crown, which is Canada, had an obligation to us as well. And when I looked at what happened with the issuing of scrip in 1885 and 1900, the government thought it was just going to be able to extinguish our rights just because they made a declaration in cabinet and put this law in place, issued a half-breed commission. When the treaties took place, our people went to the treaty negotiating that was going on, and our people were turned away. They were told that commissioners would come and have a treaty with us. Well, that never happened. So you can't deal with the province on issues of treaty. You've got to deal with the Crown, Canada. So I knew we had to establish a presence in Ottawa, and I bugged Stan Daniels, who was the president of the Métis Association of Alberta at the time. Stan had a little bit of national exposure and had gone to meetings of the National Indian Council. He knew Howard and knew the guys in Saskatchewan and the new organization that was emerging in Manitoba. He knew them too. So I bugged him to get the guys together so we could talk about having a presence in Ottawa. And we decided after some meetings to do that. And just by a quirk, I was elected the president of the Native Council of Canada. We all thought it was going to be Stan, but Stan had other ideas. And so I came to Ottawa on the strength of a $10,000 loan from Métis Association of Alberta. And when I got here, nobody seemed to know about the Métis people. They seemed to have thought that, well, here in Ottawa anyway, that our people had disappeared with the hanging of Louis Riel. And everybody was saying, well, who's the Métis? And I joined the National Press Gallery, and I was there, and this very British-throated brogue journalist said, what's a Métis? Just sort of throw it in your face kind of thing. That's the attitude people had.
Yeah.
And I wanted to meet with George Manuel, president of the National Indian Brotherhood, to say, let's work together, George, and lobby. He and I finally had a coffee, and he said, my people don't want me to meet with you. Chiefs don't want me to meet with you.
Really?
Indian Affairs doesn't want me to meet with you. They're all saying, if the Métis get recognized, George, there's only a loaf of bread here, and some of that's going to have to go to them. And people who have heard me say this before are going to be annoyed, but I'm going to say it again. I said to George, Ottawa is not a loaf of bread. Ottawa is a bakery. George, we should be dealing with Canada Mortgage and Housing about our housing issues. We should be dealing with the Department of Health about our health issues. You shouldn't be always sandwiched with Indian and Northern affairs. And our people certainly don't want to be part of that either. you don't get enough out of Indian and Northern affairs, and we have no intention whatsoever. We have no desire whatsoever to become Indians under the Indian Act. We have our own rights. We're on our own. Let's work together. Well, we were very successful in there. There was a period from when we started in 1970 to when we got into the Constitution. The negotiations were 10, 11 years later. We got into the Constitution in that period of a decade. That changed everything for us. Because now we had the law, the Constitution of Canada, we thought at the time. There is still another decade or 15 years later that we had to fight in order to make sure that the law would apply. Yeah. But the situation was manifestly different in the 60s and 70s than it is today. And the big change was because of the Constitution, getting in the Constitution.
Yeah, I can obviously see how that would be huge. I thought, there was an interesting point in that conversation you said you were having with George Manuel. And man, if that doesn't exemplify just the theories of how colonialism works, I don't know what does. That is just the epitome of those divide and rule tactics, right? When we as Native people are pitted against other Native people, who needs colonizers to oppress us, right? When we can keep each other in our place fighting over the same imagined scrap of bread, if you will.
That fighting, that division is between our peoples and within the Métis Nation. Mm-hmm. We've I don't know why our people don't realize that we're actually buying into this crab pot theory. Mm-hmm. It seems that if anybody gets ahead, so they got to be pulled down. We're holding ourselves back. We're fighting against ourselves. Yeah, I believe that it started because of colonialism, and colonialism is still at play, but not to the same degree that it used to be. And again, because of the Constitution, because of Pauli, because of the the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, that is now part of Canada's Constitution, and the ongoing obligation of Royal Proclamation of 1763, we're in a much different position. The government can try to divide us, and it will, and for its own reasons, but can't get away with it the way they used to, because they are now obligated to recognize the right of self-determination of the Métis people. Mm-hmm. Everybody has to recognize that. Not everybody is accepting it. Yeah, but it is clear that is the law, and we have that on our side.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's obviously a great leverage point for us in terms of having our Métis rights recognized and being able to exercise those rights. I was wondering if we could dig a little bit deeper and kind of get into that politics of recognition, because there's been a lot of writing about that recently. I don't know if you've ever come across the book Red Skin, White Masks, The Colonial Politics of Recognition by Glenn Coulthard.
No, I haven't. But I'm sure sounds like a good book.
It's a great book. I got to take a course with him at UBC a couple of years ago, and he's got a lot of really interesting stuff to say. I kind of credit him for being the first one to introduce me to, despite him not being Métis, we did a unit on Métis politics, and he was the first person who I read Howard Adams with and Maria Campbell with. So he kind of contributed a lot to my political awareness, which is been pretty cool. And now I actually work at the Institute for Critical Indigenous Studies at UBC right now, and his office is right across the hall from me, which is kind of funny how life works out, you know. Um, but yeah, so he kind of talks a lot about recognition, and so clearly, like recognition of Métis rights has done a lot just for the well-being of Métis people within the colonial borders of Canada. Um, Definitely improved the lives of the general population of Métis people, and I would say even the general Indigenous population. Um, but where do we go once we are recognized? Because I can't imagine that just having our rights recognized is going to be everything. Like, we'll still have to fight for them. Um, we have to figure out how we are going to identify our own people beyond what Canada wants to recognize. Um, so yeah, I just want to know how we, like, where we go from there. And maybe before we really hop into this conversation, I do want to give the audience a bit more of a background as to all of your wins with lobbying the government and the just to give them a bit of background for where we're going to jump off into this conversation from. So, if you don't mind, I'm just going to list off some of your notable achievements. Um, So, as the president of the Native Council of Canada, you successfully convinced the federal government to include Métis and non-status organizations in their core funding program, and successfully lobbied the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation to put into place the Rural and Native Housing Program. I believe that's something that you touched on just recently. Your involvement in the Powley case was a crucial step forward in setting a precedent for the definition of Métis rights. And one final one I'll point out is your role as advisor to the Native Council of Canada and Inuit Committee on National Issues in 1981, which you also mentioned yourself earlier, but I thought I'd just echo. But, leading up to the patriation of Canada's Constitution, you had co-chaired the Aboriginal Rights Coalition of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit leaders who successfully lobbied for the reinstatement of the Aboriginal Rights Clause. So the work that you've done to lobby federal and provincial governments to improve the lives of Métis people and Indigenous people as a whole has undeniably been a good thing, and you have proven to be successful with your negotiations. So as we continue to progress forward as a nation, as the Métis Nation, do you see a way in which we can begin to separate from seeking recognition from the state and instead leaning more into self-determination and self-government, using the rights we have acquired as leverage?
Yes, but we have to realize that it's not going to happen overnight.
Mm-hmm.
Dealings with governments never do. I think the biggest change for us came with the Powley case,
Mm-hmm.
because the legal system in Canada, the justice system, the legislature, the Prime Minister's office, everything centers on what's in the Constitution. So those words, the existing Aboriginal and treaty rights of the Aboriginal peoples are hereby recognized and affirmed, is damn powerful.
Mm-hmm.
Except that when it was passed, the federal government took the position that, well, the word says the existing. Well, Métis people, your rights are no longer existing because they were extinguished. So here we are in the Constitution, and then they're turning around and doing that to us. We had the fights here in Ontario against the Ministry of Natural Resources. We had openly had gatherings and hunting, and we had hunting gatherings, and we just defied the government.
Mm-hmm.
And we fought them all the way. This was going through court in the 90s. And when it got to the Supreme Court of Canada, the positions of every provincial government and the federal government was the same as the position of the Ontario government. Our rights were extinguished. But we had proved at the court level that because the people at Sault Ste. Marie, that's where this was all about in Ontario, were explicitly not included in the Robinson Treaty in 1850. Robinson said, I have a mandate for the full-bloods, but not for the half-breeds. On the basis of that, our people were cut out of the Robinson Treaty. The judge agreed with us that on the basis of that, our rights, how could they have been extinguished? They were not.
Mm-hmm.
And because of the Royal Proclamation, and again, that's part of Canada's Constitution, that's the law, Canada is obliged by that Royal Proclamation that they cannot enter into the territory of the Indigenous peoples without their consent. Well, they did that. They did it. It's history. But the fact is, they now need to obtain our consent. And the only way they can do that is through a modern treaty. The only way they can do that is to give effect. And that's the other thing that the Supreme Court of Canada said, is that the government has an obligation because of Section 35 to respect our Aboriginal treaty rights, but also to take measures to give effect to the recognition of our Aboriginal treaty rights. And so what does that mean? It means that they have to enable us to fulfill our own right of self-determination, our right of self-government. We decide who belongs. Nobody, but anybody, but us decides who belongs. We decide the policies and the rules and regulations within our own communities, how our people are going to be serviced or supported, and on what basis. Those policies are ours alone. In order to give effect to that, there has to be federal legislation that allows the federal government to allow us to do these things. Mm-hmm. It's up to the federal government to pass a law that said, yeah, we are going to implement agreements recognizing the right of self-determination of the Métis people. And they made announcements and agreements 4 or 5 years ago to do that with the provinces of all the provinces from Ontario to Alberta. Mm-hmm. Those 4 provinces. Each one has its own agreement. So our organizations are in the process of negotiating those agreements. But the federal government created a law called Bill C-31, 53, which is a Recognition Act. Mm-hmm. This means that when they transfer funds to us, the funds don't have to be then delivered on the basis of their policies anymore. Child and Family Services, for example, or funds that we get for education. We decide the terms and conditions, not them anymore. In order to do that, they have to pass a law to allow themselves to do that. Well, that law has been in Parliament. Well, there's been the Métis people of Ontario have gone through hell for the last year now because of the attacks by the chiefs of Ontario, and then the Manitoba Métis Federation, who jumped on board on these attacks, that the Métis communities in Ontario don't exist, that we are fake Métis out here. The Manitoba Métis Federation and David Chartrand and the leaders out there who were applauding Powley when we got it in 2003, and who have been relying on Powley themselves for these agreements, they're now saying that the Métis community of Sault Ste. Marie doesn't exist. I mean, give me a break. But that's been a good enough excuse for the government to say, well, you know, we have to hold off here until the Métis themselves can get their act together. So again, the whole business of divide and conquer. Oh yeah, we've got this law. I mean, it's our responsibility and we're obliged legally to do this thing, but for some reason, they're putting the onus on us now for them not to pass that law that they're obliged to pass. It'll come about. It has to come about one way or another because they're legally bound to do it. But in the meantime, you know, again, the quirks of colonialism. And what we have to deal with is stall that part of things. Meanwhile, you know, the funding agreements are continuing. We're getting funding for housing, we're getting funding for education. All the provincial Métis organizations are doing that. And but we're hamstrung by delivering on the basis of the terms and conditions that are set by the federal government, rather than us being able to do it on our own.
Yeah, to bring it back to what you were saying about the Métis communities in Ontario, I worry that it's becoming a bit of a culture war issue in the same way that we see in a lot of US politics, where they'll pick something sometimes that has some relevance to it, but then dumb it down to be a black and white issue of which you need to pick a side. I think that there's certainly, like, within Canada, there is unfortunately like some Métis communities, particularly quite far east, who are certainly not Métis. There's some databases online, like especially in Quebec and Nova Scotia, who have no ties to our historical communities and will sell memberships for a fee, things like that. So I think that, you know, we definitely have a job to do here in identifying which Métis communities are Métis and not Métis, for fear of us becoming the Canadian equivalent of, like, my great-great-grandmother was a Cherokee princess, as that someone might say in the States, right? But I think, unfortunately, that is becoming a sort of a culture war issue to also, for some reason, target every Métis community in Ontario, when there certainly is a history of the Métis being in Ontario. I can't speak to every Métis community in Ontario. I haven't looked into it myself, but certainly some of them have historical basis of being there. And like you said about the Powley case, like, that was such a big thing that every provincial rep was on board with. And I did notice as well that is something that the MMF has targeted, is the Sault Ste. Marie community, which Powley's from, right? As you said. So I think, yeah, it's a tricky gray area that's being used in somewhat of a colonial way right now, unfortunately. So
the Métis National Council has an expert panel that's been put in place. Ironically, it was the Manitoba Métis Federation that demanded this expert panel be put in place, and they pulled themselves out of the MNC before the panel could do its work, which was to look into the legitimacy of the Métis communities in Ontario. Now, that panel is going to be making its report this fall.